You have got to read Solo Leveling. If I had $1 for every time I heard this, I think I would have been able to retire. It was about 2 years ago when I first remember Solo Leveling's name being pulled into the nerd community. It was a power fantasy webtoon generating tons of hype and even getting its own anime adaptation later down the line. So what is Solo Leveling and why didn't I like the anime? In this video we'll be diving into those questions and analyzing Solo Leveling from a technical standpoint, along with giving it a rating at the end of the video. Solo Leveling started as a web novel back in February of 2014. While that might not seem that important, it actually marks a close date with the birth of a concrete name for a genre called LitRPG fantasy the year before. This term referred to fantasy novels and stories that drew upon heavy inspiration from game elements such as levels, power-ups, game rules, and a solid, tangible progression. Naturally, it's easy to see how Solo Leveling would have hit the market at the right time. People were looking for this type of well-crafted story. Understanding the landscape of storytelling and the existence of LitRPG fantasy as a whole is useful, especially when understanding how LitRPG came about. Most genres of fantasy or storytelling are being written in far before they have a name, typically just in a different, broader genre. For example, steampunk fantasy was being written as just fantasy for a long time before the genre was able to stand on its own. LitRPG and Solo Leveling in particular have done the exact same thing, with Solo Leveling having taken on the genre of power fantasy alongside LitRPG fantasy. Tracing back, one of the major influences of LitRPG fantasy was another young genre known as progression fantasy. It became more popular and concrete in about 2010, but stories in that vein had been being written long before then, naturally. Progression fantasy, as you might guess, is focused on a single character's, progression through an established rank or levels. My favorite book series of all time is actually in this genre, that being the Cradle series by Will Wright, and if you have time I highly suggest his work. Anyway, part of the charm of what genre Solo Leveling falls into is a gentle tug-of-war shown to the viewer. The tension point for these types of stories generally rely on the audience buying into a distant goal or issue, while constantly at the mercy of a bunch of little tension points. In progression fantasy, the typical perfect balance is between feeling that the MC or person working through the ranks is constantly improving at a rapid rate, but also never quite strong enough for the current issue at hand. Not until later on, at least. This relies on a few fun storytelling concepts. The first is Chekhov's gun, a basic in storytelling. Outlined by the Russian playwright Anton Chekhov, the idea is summarized in his quote, that being, if in the first act you have hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one it should be fired. Otherwise, don't put it there. All that this means is that a story element or idea must be paid off. This doesn't need to be an actual gun, obviously. For example, in the first episode of Attack on Titan, we're introduced to the basement key and the idea of the basement. And while various other smaller tension points arise and fall, it still gets paid off and the gun still fires, so to speak, at the end of Season 3. Now, in Solo Leveling, we do see that promise and payoff happen, right? Because Sun Jin-woo is given the ability to progress, and he actually does do that. However, that's where our other major story element comes into play, and the major area in which I have a critique. Author and modern fantasy titan Brandon Sanderson has taken some of these basic concepts of Chekhov and a few others to articulate what he calls promise, progress, and payoff. Where Chekhov's gun only expressly talks about the hanging of the pistol and the firing of the pistol, Sanderson puts emphasis on progress as a major connecting point. In a certain way, we can think of this as the pacing for the story, or at least for the element that is being introduced as Chekhov's gun. For me, the time frame between Sung being able to level up and him rapidly climbing isn't actually what my major problem is. His quick progression actually doesn't affect me that much. It's the fact that his rapid progression always allows him to edge out the current threat to his life, at least right now in the enemy. To be precise, while the promise of the story and the payoff of it is interesting, I don't like the progress. I felt like his life was never really in danger after he started farming on the wolves. I felt like it undermined all of the physical, mental, and emotional tension that the story suggestively promised with the premise, and I felt like it could have been brought about in a more intentional way, having him still experience losses while he got stronger. The main hook of the story wasn't handled in a way that satisfied me, or made me feel like he was still brutally fighting against all the odds. It just kinda seemed like he was unable to lose at that point forward, simply because the system denied it. And so I can't really say I liked that major part of the storytelling, simply because the genre and the story is trying to tell feels undermined. Now, let's give it my personal final rating, which is a 6.5 out of 10. You might think, whoa, you spent the whole script talking about how you didn't like it, but now you're still giving it a 6.5? And yeah, I actually am. Because even though I felt like the storytelling and the elements fell flat for me and undermined itself in my opinion, At the end of the day, the show is really cool. The cinematography and choreography is hype, the animation has that X factor, and the characters are all pretty charming to me. And so even though I didn't love it, I can absolutely see why so many people do. I think there's a pretty massive difference between not liking something, but still being able to appreciate everything it does well, and everything people like about it. Some things just aren't to my liking, even though I definitely acknowledge that there's a lot that Solo Leveling does right. Anyway, the real message of this video is, like what you like, whether you have great reasons or don't. The beauty of art is perception, and more importantly, the diversity of that perception. If you have any recommendations on Mon Mod, let me know in the description. I've only read one, that being Maybe Meant to Be, but I've got Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint on the list right now, and I'm hoping to get through a few more soon. If you enjoyed this video, pretend the subscribe button is the system and jump in as the player. Until next time, keep dreaming.